Bedford Historical Society Speaker Series is supported in part by the residents of Cuyahoga County through a public grant from the Cuyahoga Arts and Culture, and also in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Ohio Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities, Cuyahoga Arts and Culture, or the Bedford Historical Society.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our speaker series tonight. Tonight, Rebecca McFarland is here talking about Eliot Ness. Now, I'd like to turn this over to Rebecca McFarland.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad that I was invited to join you here today and to share a little bit of my research on Eliot Ness. A lot of you probably think like, oh, I know about him because I watch this TV series. In fact, we were enjoying the music when you first came in that was from the TV show. Kind of captivating. I really loved that music. The sad part is, though, this wasn't based on much fact at all, truthfully. It was a clever show. And Robert Stack, I actually got to talk to him once years ago, and he said that he was very honored to have been able to portray Eliot Ness in this TV show. But other than pretty much having his mannerisms down, it really wasn't very much, truthful, like I say. And then there was the movie starring Kevin Costner as the role of Eliot Ness. And this movie is really like almost 100% Hollywood. None of this is based in fact. I was watching it thinking like, oh my goodness, people are going to think this is what really happened. But it was plenty entertaining and a very nice movie, but not the real Eliot Ness. But truthfully, you know what? In my opinion, the real Eliot Ness is so much more fascinating than anything Hollywood could make up. And out of his whole career, his whole life, the really special time that made such a huge impact both on himself and on our city is when he came to Cleveland. Now, he was born, wouldn't it cute, in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, to a Norwegian immigrant couple, Peter and Emma Ness. When they came here, they came bringing their skill as bakers, and they had a bakery on the south side of Chicago there. And when they moved here, they started their family, and they had 4 children, rather close together, a couple of years or so, but then 14 years went by before little baby Eliot was born in April of 1902. Now, that's quite a span of time. In fact, when he was a baby, all his brothers and sisters were teenagers. So he had a lot of people telling him what to do. But he was such a nice young man as he was growing up. He got nothing but accolades from his school, said he took everything very seriously and was a very well-behaved young man. He was proud of, his grades and being able to do well in school. And by the time as he lived here with his family, he was graduated from Fenger High School. And thankfully, he was one of the few people in 1929, the great crash, he was able to go on to college because his parents' bakery was doing so very well. Well, he went to the University of Chicago, and he got a triple degree in political science, commerce, and business administration. Now, that sounds all fancy and great, but it was the beginning of the Great Depression, and jobs were hard to come by, college degree or not. And so he took a few jobs, like checking insurance claims for a living and working odd jobs here and there, but then he went to his oldest brother-in-law, who was 20 years his senior. Alexander Jamie was his name. He eventually became head of the FBI in Chicago. But he asked his brother-in-law, Alexander, he said, you're working at this brand new Prohibition Bureau for the Treasury Department, do you think they could use somebody else? Because he thought, that sounds kind of exciting. And I don't blame him. For a young man, the Prohibition Bureau and what they were doing sounded a lot more fun. And so his brother-in-law hired him. He knew he was trustworthy, honest, hardworking, and so he even permitted him to hire 10 men of his own selection to work with him. Later, they were nicknamed the Untouchables because they were so honest they wouldn't take a bribe. Now, Eliot and his Untouchables were busy busting up bootlegging all over Chicago, giving Al Capone a run for his money, because certainly Al Capone was the one making millions during the Great Depression while others were struggling. But it wasn't Eliot Ness, and Eliot Ness never took credit for the fact that Al Capone found himself on his way to Alcatraz. It was income tax evasion. It was, yes, Eliot Ness did a lot of damage to his bootlegging, but it wasn't he who sent him to jail. In fact, Eliot Ness and Al Capone never met. So that's part of Hollywood as well. Their paths just didn't cross. But when Prohibition was repealed in 1933, as was true for all the other officers working in that department, they were out of a job because they repealed Prohibition. Liquor became legal. But the Treasury Department did start a brand new department called the Alcohol Tax Unit. So once liquor became legal, there was a tax on it, and then they needed officers in that department to enforce taxes. So that was fine. Eliot wasn't unemployed for very long at all, and he found himself assigned to another department. He wasn't needed in Chicago, so they sent him down to Cincinnati. He later shared that that was the most frightening time in his life. Appalachian moonshiners wouldn't think twice to shoot you in the back, a federal officer even. But at least Al Capone's men had somewhat of a sense of honor, I guess you could say. But he did ask pretty soon after he arrived in Cincinnati if he could please get a transfer to pretty much anywhere else. Luckily for him, Cleveland had a need for somebody up here, because we had an alcohol tax unit and there were 30 men in it, but they needed a leader. So thankfully, Eliot Ness was asked to come up and help with our alcohol tax unit. There was still a lot of bootlegging going on, even though Prohibition had been repealed, because, hey, if you're making a ton of money bootlegging, why are you going to want to be honest and pay all those taxes that you weren't paying for the 13 years of Prohibition? A lot of different places were doing that. In fact, Eliot Ness found what was said to be our country's largest still. It was a 4-story still down in the flats. And of course, he put them out of business in a hurry because they didn't want to pay their tax. And not to mention all the rum running between our shores and Canada. There was plenty of that going on as well. But he did a great job with our alcohol tax unit. In fact, while he served in our alcohol tax unit, he was only 32 years old, and he was in charge of 30 men. It was a responsible job. At that time, we're talking, this is now 1934, we were regarded the 5th largest city in our country, but we were the #1 most dangerous city in our country. No other major city had more murder, rape, robbery, juvenile crime, or automobile accidents than we did in Cleveland. City was in trouble. We needed a new mayor for 1935. There was a campaign for mayor going on. And people were like, never mind if you're Republican or Democrat, let's just fix this city. Kind of like now with the country, but at any rate. Mayor Harold Burton ran on an independent ticket, and his promise was he was going to make our city safe again, and he was going to do something about crime. And the other candidates weren't promising the same, so he was soundly voted in as our mayor. Now, I've never been wrong. You watch. Anytime a new mayor of Cleveland is selected, his first order of business within the first 24 hours, choose a new safety director. And so with Mayor Burton, he was looking around. He needed a safety director, someone who would be in charge of all facets of police and fire. He saw promise in Eliot Ness and asked Eliot Ness if he wouldn't serve as our city's safety director in 1935. Eliot Ness, I guess because he was young and optimistic, only 32 years old, still our city's youngest ever safety director, he thought, why not? Can't get any worse. We were already the most dangerous city in the country, so there's nowhere to go but up. And so he accepted the job, and in December of 1935, he became our safety director. Our chief of police at that time was George Matowitz, another good, honest man, but he was old enough to be Eliot Ness's grandfather. But he had to answer to Eliot Ness, this new young whippersnapper coming here out of Chicago, and he was going to turn our city around when he didn't even know our city. So there was a lot of doubt there, but everybody was kind of standing back and having confidence in him. Mayor Harold Burton, was in that white suit. Don't know why, but he favored white suits, looking very dapper there. Had his confidence in Eliot Ness that he would make an impact. Eliot Ness, you see, and I think personally, this is what makes the difference. He wasn't a police officer. He wasn't an FBI agent. He did not use a gun. He had a college degree in business, and I think that worked well for him because when he came, he knew right away a lot of changes had to be made. On the personal side, which is kind of interesting in itself too, he brought with him his new young bride, a lady he had met in Chicago. She went with him to Cincinnati, and then together they were transferred to Cleveland rather swiftly. Her name was Edna Staley. She was what they used to call a blue blood, kind of used to the finer things in life, horseback riding and so on like that. But with Eliot, she just found a real happiness. You might not know, Eliot was an accomplished ballroom dancer. Maybe it was all those older sisters practicing on him, who knows. But Edna loved it because they would go dining and dancing a lot. In fact, in the 1930s in Cleveland, if you were going to do anything on a Saturday night, besides coming here, you would have gone downtown Cleveland to one of our many hotel ballrooms. The Statler, the Hollenden, of course, the Cleveland Hotel. I'm so glad they're putting that name back on it again. Many hotels that had big ballrooms. For $1.50, you got a blue plate special for dinner, and then you could dance the night away to big bands. I mean, Tommy Dorsey, Bing Crosby, Bob Hope, Kate Smith came, you name it. They were all here in Cleveland at that time, and Eliot and Edna would love going down and dancing away the night. While they were married, they lived in this cottage in Bay Village on the lake. They were provided this home pretty swiftly after coming to Cleveland, and the house is actually behind another house that's on Lake Road. So if you've ever driven down Lake Road, I'm permitted to say it now because they tore it down last summer. I know, I was sworn to secrecy, but now it's no secret, it's an empty lot, so it doesn't matter so much anymore. But this tiny cottage, this was the main house on Lake Road, which was also torn down. But you see down the driveway there's a two-car garage that's separate. Well, their little cottage was actually behind the two-car garage. And it had a beautiful view of the lake because it was right there on the lake. And Eliot and Edna enjoyed living there. It's just the tiniest little cottage. It was half the size of this room, half the size. It's the size of a two-car garage. One bedroom, one bathroom, just tiny, tiny. But they were very happy. One thing is true about Eliot Ness, he was a bit of a workaholic, however. And I was told from people who knew him years ago that he rarely left his office before 10 o'clock at night. Now, Bay Village is not an easy drive downtown. It would have been a good hour for him to drive downtown. There was no I-90 at that time, so he was away from home a lot, but Edna loved the peace and quiet of the area there in Bay Village. Eliot, meanwhile, was so busy on the job. I mean, our city was so corrupt and in so much trouble. He had a lot to do. One of the first things that he noticed was our police officers had never been trained till that point. We didn't have a police training academy. Prior to his arrival, if you wanted to be a police officer, it was kind of, sure, here's a gun, here's a badge, why don't you watch that corner over there? It was way too casual. None of the officers were really ready to handle the crime of a big city, and knowing we were the 5th largest city, there was a lot of crime to take care of. So what he did first thing was he instituted a police training academy modeled after the FBI's. The trainees were taught all sorts of things. In fact, Eliot Ness was also a master of jiu-jitsu, and he taught that to the officers as well. He wanted them to be able to move well with coordination as well as speed, to learn everything about firearms that they needed to know, and the rules of the city as well. At that time, other major cities had motorcycle units. We did not, but he felt that we should. We could have motorcycles go in and out of a traffic situation a lot quicker than tying up one of our cruisers. It's still the Great Depression, and our city only had 32 police cruisers. It's a pretty big demographic area for only 32 cruisers, so we felt that these motorcycles could help with that matter as well. Now, ever since the beginning of our city, we've had a mounted unit, and some people know of Cowan pottery here. Well, Victor Schreckengost, who is also a Cowan potterer, was a friend of Eliot Ness, and he made the monument that's down there crediting Hugh O'Neill from the East Side for helping the mounted unit. You see, Eliot Ness was told by our city leaders at that time that although the officers on the horse are on the city payroll, the horses aren't, and they're expensive to feed and take care of. So the horses had gone by the wayside at the beginning of the Great Depression because they said, we don't need them, they're too expensive to take care of. But Eliot Ness insisted that a large city should have a mounted unit. If the city wasn't going to pay for it, he went to private industry and asked Hugh O'Neill if he wouldn't subsidize the horses for the mounted unit. I actually asked a mounted officer, I said, I need to understand, why was it so passionately important to Eliot Ness why we should have a mounted unit? I mean, they're fun to see in a parade and all, and children love them, but do we really have to have them? And they said, yes. Simply put, if there's a crowd that's pushing onto something, an officer might say, back up, and maybe you will, maybe you won't. But if a 2,000-pound horse is telling you to back up, you're going to move. And I thought, enough said, I understand. And so he brought back our police mounted unit as well. We had plenty of detectives, so when a bomb went off in the Cleveland Playhouse, the detectives could have taken care of it and found out what was behind all this, but Eliot Ness was a man who wanted to be out on the streets seeing what was going on in the city. He felt it was the best way to get to know the city, which was kind of his adopted city. He was still new here with us, but he wanted to know what was going on. Today, even I don't know who's our current safety director. I used to know, they changed so fast. But you know what, when Eliot Ness was our safety director, everybody knew. There was no surprise with that. In fact, he would often go out to a criminal situation and he would bring photographers from the press, the plain dealer, or the leader, saying, hey, bring some extra bulbs in your pocket. This is going to be exciting. And he never let them down. It wasn't that he was a showboater or an egotist that wanted his face in the papers. He wanted the people to know the city is making efforts to clean up crime. And it really did a wonderful PR thing for the rest of us to feel comforted to know the police are doing their job. and that we could feel good about that. When Mrs. McGillicuddy went to get a permit to walk in the St. Patrick's Day parade, did he need to be there smiling and looking at her? No, but he wanted to be because it was another opportunity to reach out to a very large group of people, because our St. Patrick's Day parade's always been huge, and that let people know he cares and he's watching out, and the police are going to be there also. You see, we didn't know that the police were always there having our backs, but when he came to town, he let them know. He worked out regularly at the Dewey Mitchell Health Club in the Standard Building. In fact, they've just redone the Standard Building to apartments, and do you know what? The 7th floor where the Dewey Mitchell Health Club was, they're making that their health club now. That's kind of neat that the new owner wanted to keep it that way, but just like Eliot Ness did when he went to visit. But Eliot Ness was really of the people. He wanted to be wherever people were. If he could have come here to talk to you, he would have. He loved going to community gatherings and to tell people about safety. His letterhead said on the bottom, "Look both ways before you cross the street." You think, really? Was that necessary? But I guess it was, because automobile accidents were at the top of the list. No other city had accidents like we did. And he wanted to remind people what it took to be safe. Juvenile crime was horrible. And so he thought, well, it's pretty easy to know how to take care of juvenile crime. Give them something else to do. And so he asked his officers if they wouldn't each serve as a scoutmaster for Boy Scout troops. And they would use church basements, they would use City Hall, they would use wherever they could. And they started Boy Scout troops all over the city, incorporating thousands of children into a program where they could learn skills, how to fish, do woodworking, whatever, just so they could grow up to be better people and not be led into a life of crime like the Great Depression kind of led a lot of people who were basically good people into doing some crime. He took a look at our city and the way it was laid out. We had way too many districts. We had 18 districts when he came, and that was so chopped up. It wasn't efficient because they each took care of their own little neighborhood, but they weren't looking at the bigger picture. And like I said, we only had 32 police cruisers. And what he did, which I tell you, he was a marketing genius. It made the headlines of the New York Times because he painted our cruisers red, white, and blue. You know, the red, the white stripe, and the blue. Put a cherry on top, as they used to call it, and a brass emblem on the door saying police. Well, every car prior to that was a black sedan. And if you were lucky enough as to have a car in the 30s, you drove a black sedan. And so nobody knew that the police cars were out there until he painted them these garish bright colors, so that now you knew the police were out there watching over us. Again, it gave a lot of comfort to the residents of the city to know the police are out there watching over us. On the reverse side too, any of those few officers who were on the take during the Great Depression, they weren't going to drive a red, white, and blue clown car behind a store looking for graft out the back door, not when you're driving something like what they were. But what Eliot Ness did was he looked at those many districts and he said, we need 6. 6 districts will be able to patrol the city much more efficiently. And he laid out the boundaries for those. And do you know what? To this day, those boundaries have changed, but just a teeny little bit. He had such a hand on the population and where it lived in the city and how it should be patrolled. So today, those same 6 districts are working really well. He also introduced radio-controlled police cars. For heaven's sakes, all the other major cities had radios in the police cruisers, but our police were still getting out. Remember the old movies where they had the Murphy call box on a stick out there? They had the big key to open the door and turn the cranks, and that would ring a bell down at the station, but they didn't know. They knew where the problem was, but what do you need, a fire truck, an ambulance, or what? And that's silly. Radio-controlled cars told the officers right away, what's the problem, what do you need, and where. And that increased the speed and efficiency of police communication beyond anything believed possible, also making the news nationally. We had the accident prevention squads driving around town in their bright yellow canary cars, and their only job was to look and see, because of this automobile accident problem we had, do we need another crosswalk? Do we need another stop sign? Or what is it that we need to cut down on the accidents that are happening? Prior to Eliot Ness, we didn't have organized parking, believe it or not. You parked where you felt like it. This way, that way, crooked. And he said, no, we need to get this under control as well. He instituted parking meters. I don't know what he put in that, a penny, a nickel? But at any rate, it kept people parked in a logical manner so that that too was a little more efficient and definitely more safe. Do you know, as I said, when he first arrived, we were the most dangerous city in the country. And in only 4 short years, we won the National Safety Award. I think that is so awesome. Truly, that can only be credited to Eliot Ness and what he did. Because now, all of a sudden, we won safety awards. In fact, every resident of the city of Cleveland received a letter from their insurance company saying that we recognize the city of Cleveland is safer these days, and so here's a check as a refund on your insurance. When does that happen in our lifetimes? Like never. But the insurance companies recognized how wonderful that our city had turned around. And Eliot Ness could be very proud, I'm sure. But again, he was such a modest man, he just didn't take any accolades himself. So Mayor Burton was so grateful to Eliot Ness for what he was doing to turn the city around for safety. But he said to him, you know, that little house you have out there in Bay Village is awfully far from the city. It's not mandatory, but it might be a good example if you would choose a home within the boundary of the city of Cleveland. So he took an apartment at the Hampton House on Lake Road, just inside of Cleveland from Lakewood. It was a very nice apartment house in its day, and you know what? It still is today, a very nice apartment house. And so Eliot was glad to go ahead and move into this, but Edna was kind of used to that little cottage and liked it so well. But also it was almost kind of like they weren't really married because he was like never home. So they talked about it. They both had wanted children and nothing was happening. So they decided to quietly get divorced. She moved back to Chicago, moved in with family, always kept the name Ness. Never married again, and just, you know, lived her life out happily with family there in Chicago. Meanwhile, he still did the dining and dancing downtown Cleveland because that's what people did on a Saturday. Whether you're single or married, everybody went downtown to just kind of get out of the house and do something festive that way. And that's where he met Eveline McAndrews. Eveline was a very popular lady in that she was a talented artist. She sketched all the ladies' dress advertisements for the Press, the Plain Dealer, and the Leader. See, back then in the 30s, they didn't take photographs of models wearing a dress. They were all hand sketched, and she's the one who did it. She also was busy in that she was asked by children's authors to illustrate books. So she did that on the side as well. She was a very happy, bouncy, wonderful person. They say when she came into a room, the whole room just lit up even brighter because she was just that sort of personality. And definitely it caught Eliot Ness's eye. And since he was single for a handful of months, after they met, he just fell head over heels for her, and 4 months later, they were married. And because that's what you did back then, you know? You didn't live together, you married her. Together, while they were married under the name Ness, you see Eveline Ness, she started writing books as well as illustrating other people's books. And in fact, if we have any librarians here or teachers, you might be impressed to know that she won the Caldecott Award Medal for one of her books. She was very accomplished that way. Together, they lived in this house down at the mouth of the Rocky River. It is the Clifton Lagoons there, and this house has quite an interesting history to itself. You can see the seam between the first floor and the second floor. It was built only as a one-story building by Alexander Winton. He's the one who made the Winton automobile in the late 1800s. He also had his mansion that I got to tour when I was a little girl in Lakewood on the property of where now is Winton Place and Pier W. And it was the second owner of the home who put the second floor on, and that was, and I'm sure you know, Vernon Stouffer of Stouffer's Foods. Now they did that. Vernon and Gordon Stouffer wanted to use this property just for their grandchildren to put on their bathing suits. It looks very important, but it's really very small. And the beach is right across the street there where they could go and swim in Lake Erie. The map room on top for sailing, because Alexander Winton used the building to put his sails in when he would come in off the lake. The Stouffer brothers just used it, just like I say, for the beach when they were there. But they weren't really using it at this time. So when Eliot married Eveline, the Stouffer brothers said to him, would you like to live in this house? Because we're not using it. And so they liked the fact that it was quite remote. In fact, there's still a guard at the top of the hill. You have to be able to get past in order to see this home at the mouth of the river. And they thought it was great. Eveline loved it because of that third floor with the windows all around. It gave her lots of light to do her drawings. So as busy as Eliot was, helping curb crime in Cleveland and make it a better place to live, she was happily busy with her books. So this time it didn't matter so much that he was kind of married to his job as well. As you might have heard, during his time as our safety director from 1935 to 1942, we had the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run going around the city, chopping up people into pieces and parts and leaving those pieces, parts around the city. To this day, it still stands as our country's largest unsolved serial murder. It can't be solved. There is no forensic evidence. Trust me, I've tried. I've been on the board of trustees for the Police Museum for 35 years, and we've tried every angle possible. One of the victims, Rose Wallace here, they did a death mask that they had on display at the Cleveland Exposition in 1936 to try and identify some. The other was Flo Polillo, only 42 years old there. Man, she lived a hard life in the Roaring Third. But the murder was never found. That was the one thing in his time here as our safety director that wasn't solved. However, it was very clear to Eliot Ness who did it. And I have no doubt it was Frank Sweeney. He was psychotic. He was mentally imbalanced in so many ways that we'd be here forever trying to diagnose him. But he was a doctor. During the war, I don't know where he got a little off balance, but it was pretty clear to Eliot Ness he had done it. He had even brought in Edward Kefauver from Chicago, who came up with the lie detector and tied this man to it for a whole week down at the Cleveland Hotel. And Kefauver said to Ness, "This is your man. He is guilty as all get out." But that wasn't going to stand up in court. Eliot was a by-the-book sort of man, and he wanted to make certain that he had everything right before he would take him to court. Meanwhile, the newspapers were tired of having the Kingsbury Run murders on their front page all the time. So Louis Seltzer, owner of the Press, threatened the mayor and said, these have to stop. And the mayor said, we're trying, we're doing everything, you know, Eliot Ness and blah, blah, blah. But he just went around the mayor's back and went to the county sheriff and said to the county sheriff, solve it, get this off our papers. So the county sheriff went and found this man on the right, Frank Dolezal, who barely spoke English. He was a bricklayer, and said, you did it. And the man didn't even know what he was being blamed for. He did live in the Roaring Third, where some of the victims did. Most of the victims were down in the bend of the flats there, where Kingsbury Run is located. But this poor man was taken to jail, was encouraged, shall we say, to confess. He had broken ribs, a broken clavicle, broken this and that, and man, I'd confess if you beat me that badly. But the poor man didn't even understand. And then within hours, he allegedly hung himself out of remorse. Now, I saw his autopsy photos, and there's a clear ligature mark around his neck. But they say he hung himself from a towel on a hook that was actually shorter than he, and I think that's kind of physically impossible to do. But at any rate, that poor man was blamed for it. But meanwhile, Eliot Ness had gone to the family of Sweeney and said, you need to have him put in an insane asylum for the criminally insane, and they did. So the murder stopped, but it was not because of that poor other man being arrested. As is true, like I say, when a new mayor came, Mayor Burke came in, and Eliot Ness found himself without a job. No offense to him, he couldn't have done a better job for our city, that's for certain. But a new mayor wants to choose a new safety director, and that was okay with Eliot because, you know what, the position didn't pay very well. And so he was glad to be able to use his college degree. And so he took a job with the Social Protection Agency because of the war. And you might wonder, what did he do there? Well, he wrote pamphlets to warn the young soldiers away from those ladies of the night, shall we say, who might be carrying different diseases that they should worry about for social protection. So that is what he warned them about for his 2 years serving during the wartime. After that, he came back to Cleveland and took a job managing as the director of the Diebold Corporation down in Canton. Now, they had not been doing all that well, but he really had such a good head for business. And he put that company back on its feet. Heck, there's not an ATM machine, it seems, or even a bank vault that you see that doesn't have Diebold on it. In fact, I traveled to Colorado this summer, sat in a historic old restaurant. Next to me was a bank vault. What did it say on top? Diebold, Canton, Ohio. I thought, wow, it's everywhere. But he did very well there, and he was very happy with Eveline. And they had moved to the east side in another apartment for a while. But again, they both really wanted children, but it just wasn't happening. And so I think, truthfully, and I spoke with Victor Schreckengost about this and a couple of other friends of Eliot Ness, and I said, it seems to me that Eveline and Eliot were more like just really good friends who kind of lived together than husband and wife. And he agreed with me, and I think for that reason, Eveline said, you know, it's not working for us. So they were going to quietly get a divorce. But she said, and when does this happen that a second wife chooses a third wife for her husband? But she did. Eveline said, I know the girl for you. It's not me, but I know the girl for you. Eveline wanted to move to New York because her publisher was asking her, oh, you got to move here because your children's books are doing so well. And they did. She became a millionaire thanks to her books doing so very well. But she said to Eliot, you need a lady who's going to sit at home, make a pot roast, have some children, and just really settle down. And that is what he wanted. So when she introduced Eliot to her friend Elizabeth, They both taught together at the Cleveland Institute of Art. They both knew each other for years, and they were both in the art field, although Elizabeth was a Cowan potterer. She worked under the name Seaver, so her works aren't under the name Ness. She was very young because Cowan Pottery closed in 1933. But, Anderson, Seaver was her first married name. That didn't work out, but thankfully when she met Eliot Ness, they couldn't have been happier. It really was love at first sight. They married 2 months after they met, and truly they were happy just forever and on. Her works there are on display in the Cowan Pottery Museum, which you can see in the Rocky River Library. However, they are also at the New York Museum of Art, the Cleveland Museum of Art, Chicago, and other places around the country. Her pieces were that well recognized. But she didn't care about glory for working as a Cowan potterer. She was just so happy to be married to Eliot. They took an apartment on Ford Drive, which is right across from Mather on the campus of Case Western Reserve University. They were so happy together. She stayed home, made the pot roast. He went on to the Debo Company, which was quite a commute. That tells you he loved Cleveland. He commuted to Canton every day. But still, they weren't able to have children, which was something they both wanted as well. So they decided to adopt. And they adopted a little boy named Robert from an orphanage in Ashtabula. I don't know why they would have gone that far east, but they did. And Robert was just a cute little boy. He was 3 years old when they adopted him. And their family was just so perfect. They couldn't have been happier in their home there. Elizabeth would take Robert off to school in their neighborhood, and Eliot went off to work, and everything was good. People in Cleveland, however, knew around the year of 1947 that a new mayor was coming on board. Actually, the incumbent was going to be reelected on the Democrat ticket, but they wanted somebody to give him a run for his money on the Republican ticket. So friends have asked him, wouldn't he like to run for mayor of Cleveland on the Republican ticket? They said, surely all of us remember what you did to turn our city around and make it a good place to live once again. And he really thought, yeah, I'm not really into politics, but he thought, well, why not? It'll be something interesting to do. So Mrs. Anderson here was Elizabeth's mother. Together they were everywhere helping him. He had the signs up on trees around town. He rode in parades every opportunity. Elizabeth always by his side. You know, she spelled Elizabeth with an S because she also was Norwegian, just as he, which is kind of nice. They had that in common as well. They would drive down all the streets in Cleveland. He'd glad hand and kiss babies and do all that. He was even at the West Side Market, where I just marveled that grapefruits 12 for 33 cents. I mean, gee, what are they, like $3 each now or something insane? But there was this billboard on the side of a building that stood for decades of time. Just didn't want to take it down. It is down now, but it's on Huff Avenue. It's a parking lot now, but it was a testament to what he meant to the city. I think that they left it up for so very long. He had just a wonderful reputation for what he did as our safety director. When he was soundly defeated 2-1 in the mayor race, it was okay with him because his heart really wasn't in it. He just wasn't a politician, and that was all right because he was happy doing his job at the Debo Company. And then another friend comes along and says, you know what? I have got the perfect job for you. It is with the Guarantee Paper and Fidelity Company in Coudersport, Pennsylvania. Don't ask me where that is. It's 4.5 hours east of here, not near anything. Coudersport is in the middle of dense forest all around because that's where the paper company was, about 2.5 hours east of Pittsburgh. That's about as close as I can tell you to anything you recognize. But they had come up with the idea of watermarking paper to prevent forgery. And he thought, this is cutting edge. This is the thing of the future. And he was right. There's not an important paper we have or a dollar bill we have, for all that's worth these days, that isn't watermarked. And it was a genius idea. And so he asked his wife and son to move with him to Coudersport, Pennsylvania, left it all behind. And that took something big to get him out of Cleveland, because this is what he loved. And when he went there, it was a big job, that's for sure. He rented this home in Coudersport, which is literally First and Main, that's it. And this house was on one corner, a hotel was on another, and some shops. Tiny town, beautiful home. He just rented it while he was there. But what he didn't know was it was a struggle to get this company up and going with the watermarking. He didn't realize that the men who invited him there, the other directors on the board, they lied to him. They said they had the patent for watermarking, and they didn't. They hadn't even applied for it. And Eliot was scrambling to do that and to ask the paper companies if they could retool their machinery to embed a watermark. And that too was a battle, because they didn't want to. It was going to be expensive, and they didn't see the value like Eliot did. And he invested every penny he had in this company, which struggled terribly while he was there in Coudersport. Another friend of his from New York, Oscar Fraley, came to call and said, you know what, while you're busy with all this business with the watermarking, I've got a great idea. You should write a book about your years in Chicago. And in the letters you could read at the Western Reserve Historical Society, he said to Oscar, it was 2 years of my life. It wasn't that big of a deal. And Oscar Fraley said, no, I'm sure it is. It really would make for a great story, and we'll just collaborate on it. And Eliot said, I'm not a writer. I don't know how to write a book. And Oscar said, that's okay. I'll do the writing. You just give me the information. And I think it might have been a happy distraction for him. So he said, all right, what the heck, why not? And so Oscar Fraley would come every now and then to this hotel in Coudersport, and they'd sit up in a room, and Eliot would tell them stories about his time with busting up stills and Al Capone and all that. And his older sisters had kept a scrapbook for him, which is also at the Western Reserve Historical Society. And so Oscar Fraley got to see the scrapbooks and listen to Eliot. And then he'd go back to New York, and then they would go back and forth every couple weeks, and Oscar would say, okay, I've got another chapter done, give me more information. And after not long at all, Oscar told him the book is finished, it's all ready. It was in galley edition, which we call before it actually goes to the publisher, and he sent a copy to Eliot Ness. And in a letter you can read also at the Historical Society, Eliot Ness wrote back to Oscar Fraley and said, this isn't my story. This isn't what I told you. And Oscar had pretty much made it all up. And he said, I told you, this way, that way, and you wrote it differently. And Oscar said, tough. It's going to be a bestseller. If you don't like it, you can sign off the rights to it, and I'll give you $300 today. And he took it. He took it. He needed the money because the paper company wasn't going anywhere. And he needed the money to feed his family. So he signed off all rights to the book. Eliot Ness never knew that Oscar Fraley was right. It was a runaway bestseller. And he never knew that Desilu Productions would have the rights to the book to start a TV show and hire Robert Stack. He never knew because he died of a heart attack only 7 months after moving to Coudersport. He was only 54 years old. But when Eliot Ness died and the book was a huge success, his wife couldn't benefit a penny. He left her $9,000 in debt. If that doesn't tell you he was honest, nothing would. She could only afford to have him cremated. She brought his ashes back to Cleveland because she hadn't been there very long, and this is really her hometown. She had a memorial service at the Church of the Covenant. If you know, this is right across from the entrance of University Hospital's main campus. Church of the Covenant, hundreds of people came to, pay honor to him, but it didn't help her much because she had to take a job at a lunch counter. She sold ladies' dresses. She took in other people's children for daycare. She did anything she could and taught pottery too. She did what she could to earn a living to be able to finish raising their son, who was only 10 years old when Eliot Ness died. So she stayed here in Cleveland the rest of her years. Truly, young Robert there with her. She was glad to have met Robert Stack and said he was such a gentleman, and she, kind of taught him about how Eliot would walk and talk and his mannerisms and so on. Otherwise, the rest was all Hollywood. But she was honored to have met him. But, she died in such poverty, she never got out of debt. She never was able to even afford her own apartment. She lived with other people who would take her in kindly. She ended her days in San Juan Capistrano, California, living with a cousin. Young Robert, however, stayed here. He went to high school here and then actually started taking classes at the brand new Cleveland State University. He'd like to be an electrical engineer. But unfortunately, as he was studying at Cleveland State as a young man, he contracted leukemia. Now, leukemia was kind of maybe curable in some instances, and he was being treated at St. Luke's Hospital, where he was getting his treatments, and he would regularly go to this one particular nurse, and they fell in love. And they were both so optimistic that the leukemia was going to go away and he was going to get better, and it was magical. They were just so happy and so in love. And unfortunately, they went on a honeymoon. When they came back, the leukemia came back with a flourish also and took him at a very young age. So unfortunately, young Robert died just 20 years after his father Eliot had died. Elizabeth remembered fondly, her time with Eliot, never married again, always just only thought of him. As I say, was glad to have met Robert Stack, but that was as far as it went. She didn't benefit. The same calendar year, it was 1976, that her son, Robert, had died. She passed away also. She was so poor, her ashes were put in a brown paper lunch bag and mailed back here. Eliot, when he died, his ashes were put in a cardboard shoebox because she couldn't afford anything else at that time. But thankfully, when the people who were doing the A&E biography of Eliot Ness came to town, I took off several days of work. I was at the Rocky River Library at the time, and I took him all around the city and showed him where he lived, where he worked, and all that sort of thing. But I said, the one thing I don't know is whatever happened to his ashes. I couldn't find that he was buried anywhere. But, that was all I could tell him. A year later, after that biography of Eliot Ness aired, one of the producers called and said it bothered him that he knew something I didn't about Eliot Ness. And he says, I'll tell you where the ashes are, but I'm only going to give you a woman's first name and her phone number, and the rest is up to you. So I thought, well, okay. So I called her up, and I said, the old, you don't know me, but I understand you have his ashes. And she did. She had Eliot Ness's ashes, Robert's, and Elizabeth's in her garage in Chesterland. And so it took me about a year to win her over and win her trust. And I asked her if we could do a funeral for them so that he can be honored and put in a resting place where others can remember him and what he did for Cleveland as well. And so she agreed, and it was wonderful. I made up a committee of FBI, ATF, Secret Service, police, fire, and together we planned a funeral where over 2,000 people attended, international media. He's big in Japan and Australia. I can only think because of the TV show. I want them to know about the real Eliot Ness. But his ashes are dispersed in Wade Lake of Lakeview Cemetery. I went to the cemetery and asked them, I said, I've got the ashes of them, may we do it in Wade Lake? Because the one restriction the person gave me was that he must be buried in water. I don't know why, except that it was a place where he could relax. He used to ride the C&B and C&D boats, Cleveland Buffalo, Cleveland Detroit, just round trip because he felt safe on a boat. Maybe that's why, I don't know. But it was wonderful that his ashes are now in the lake behind Wade Chapel. There's a monument just down the street a little bit, not near the land there around the lake. But that monument, I'm told, is one of the most busiest visited monuments in all of Lakeview Cemetery, which I find surprising, but how nice. I just only hope they know of him for the right reasons. But they lifted a ban when I asked if I may have his funeral here. They said there's been a policy that no one may be buried in Wade Lake for over 140 years. And I asked if they'd make an exception, and they did. It took them no time at all to say yes, that would be fine. So now we do have a place to remember him. His monument, as I say, is up the street a bit. They have a pathway up to it now because they just couldn't grow grass. So many people go there to visit. But I hope now at least you can know a little bit more about the real Eliot Ness, and knowing that he wrote a letter to Oscar Fraley saying, that book is not my story and I want nothing to do with it. That book is what the series The Untouchables was based on, and Kevin Costner's movie The Untouchables loosely based on, but it just wasn't his story. But I think more than what he did in Chicago, I think his pride was really here in Cleveland. So thank you so much for your kind attention. If anybody has any questions.